WSDQ Dunlap, WEPG South Pittsburgh, The Copperhead, WSDT Saudi Daisy, Chattanooga.
The viewpoints expressed on LibertyWorks Radio Network are not necessarily those of the network, its affiliates, or sponsors. This is LibertyWorks Radio Network. Now live from coast to coast and around the globe. More real talk, the kind you want, on LibertyWorks Radio Network.
And good afternoon to all of you LibertyWorks radio listeners out there. This is the Truth Attack Hour on Fridays at 5 p.m. Central, 6 Eastern, 4 would be Mountain from Central. From Central for 2 hours would be, I'm already messing up. Hey, folks, this is the Truth Attack Hour, and on Fridays, I'm your host. My name's Larry Becraft. I'm sitting here in my office in Huntsville, Alabama, and I extend a warm invitation to you to listen to this program because over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about, engaging in some very fundamental presentations of things that relate to taxes. And that's exactly what we're going to be getting into today. Today, we're going to be getting into some things that we left off last week. Last week, we started on the topic of the constitutional foundation for the federal income tax. And we're going to be getting into that matter today, as well as the statutory foundation for the federal income tax, because our purpose is to educate people. And to assist me in doing this, a very important task is my co-host, probably a whole lot of other things I could say about what we do, but it's my good friend from Mesa, Arizona, Gary Thomason. Gary, you with us?
Good afternoon. Absolutely. Good afternoon, Larry, and of course, a wonderful good afternoon / evening to all the LibertyWorks radio listeners. And now, Gary, I think it's been. I'm sorry. You
often talk about during, like for the last 3 and 4 months, you've been talking about how hot it is out where you live. So today, here in North Alabama, I would say we got up to maybe 65 degrees. We're getting into fall weather. It'll probably get down in the mid-40s this evening. It's jacket weather. What is it like in Arizona?
Well, you're not going to believe this, but at this time of year, right now it's 84 degrees with
nice
15% humidity.
Nice.
So it feels like 75. But we love this time of year, of course, because between now and at the end of April, it's going to be between 72 and 85 degrees every day.
Ooh.
And we may have a couple cold days, but I need to get your rear end out here sometime so we can go up to Sedona and see the Red Rocks and enjoy some scenery for a change.
Yeah, and also eat some good steaks too.
Yeah,
and
they got some good barbecue.
Football. Have you seen that LSU is bumping right up against number 1 Bama?
Isn't that funny how that works?
Yeah, and the first full weekend of combat between those two is going to be November, which is not very far off. November the 9th.
Yes. It's going to be a good show.
For sure. Well, hey, Gary, let's get around to talking about, picking up where we were last week, but I want to ask you these questions.
Yes, sir.
Haven't you seen, this is a reference to some of the debates that have been going on, the Democratic Party, what they're contending, the battle that's going on with President Trump. Here we have the Biden situation. He is seen saying, I am going to withhold billions of dollars worth of money from you unless you fire a prosecutor. And that happened. And so he withholds more than $1 billion worth of aid to Ukraine. He does this and admits it all on when he's talking before at a conference of the Council on Foreign Relations. And he admits the very same thing that they accused Trump of doing. But they refused to admit that, Trump was doing nothing, and the very thing that they're accusing Trump of having done, which he didn't do, was done by Joe Biden.
Yeah.
Does that sound consistent?
It's absolutely consistent, but what's crazy is that the media is so on board with these criminal, numbskulls that they take it in stride. It's just almost as if they expected Joe Biden to be, filled with corruption, $1.5 billion for his son, $50,000 a month for a little graft program that he had going over in the Ukraine. I mean, it's just insanity to actually think that people are in agreement with what Joe Biden and Obama and these, leftist thugs are doing. It's crazy.
You hit the nail on the head. Well, hey, let's shift around to the topic of what our purpose is this afternoon on this program, which is to educate our listeners somewhat about taxes. But in order to do that, I want to get into another debate affair, something that relates to the campaigns of some of the Democratic parties, presidential contenders, and specifically Pocahontas. What have you seen that Pocahontas is trying to promote? It relates to taxation. What are the hot topics right now that she's talking about in reference to taxes?
Well, she's going to raise taxes to the point where nobody can afford to breathe. She's going to
that is true.
Make welfare, turn everybody into a welfare recipient essentially. Hey, she was trying to outdo Bernie, and it looks like Bernie's probably going to drop out of the race. So, she's going to kind of move into his slot. And then, of course, you have Biden, who's never turned his back on a corrupt opportunity. I mean, he is the epitome of a typical graft level politician.
So
I mean, if you offered him $1 million to steal the Statue of Liberty, he'd do it.
Yeah. But hey, what I was talking about in reference to Pocahontas' proposals regarding taxes is her wealth tax. Haven't you heard her make statements about the wealth tax?
Yeah. It's just another way of saying we're going to tax the rich, but while we're on our way to doing that, we're going to tax the heck out of everybody.
Yeah, but my question is, this gets it back around to knowing something about the fundamental nature of federal taxation, the constitutional restraints on it. If people were somewhat familiar with at least some of the basics, what would pop into their mind when she started talking about this tax on wealth is, well, hey, the way you're going to do it is probably going to be unconstitutional. The only way that the federal tax on wealth could be imposed at the federal level would be by an apportioned tax, which is extremely difficult to do, especially on wealth. And yet nobody is talking anything about that. What she would want to do to make it, at least manageably collectible, she would impose, and this is what I think her proposal is, they're going to take a certain percentage, like 2% of the wealth of people having wealth above a certain figure. Well, that is a uniform tax. It is not an apportioned tax. But as the Supreme Court has repeatedly held, if you sit down and you read that, the Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust case, when they're talking about the exercise of the power of direct taxation and what is subject to direct taxation, property, that is exactly what a wealth tax would be, a direct tax that would be required to be apportioned. Isn't this, one of the reasons why people need to know something about the constitutional requirements regarding federal taxes? It has a direct impact upon debates that we're watching today.
And it'd be curious to see how they're going to draft that with keeping Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4 in perspective.
Yeah.
Because when you say direct tax, that's got to be the portion throughout all the states. How can that be fair when she's going to be taxing the wealth of certain people? And like maybe in Arkansas, there's not going to be enough people to satisfy her.
Yeah.
We've gone to the point where everything is insane. It's just insanity on steroids.
However, this wealth tax, let's make it constitutional by shifting around the discussion a little bit. If they came out and asked to an American that is protected by apportionment for the tax to be imposed on his wealth, it would have to be apportioned. However, if you made the wealth tax a privilege tax, and the privilege applied, to have, exercising the privilege to have wealth, it would be an alien would be the party that would have a privilege to holding wealth in this country. Well, then, if that is a privilege that's being taxed, then you could do it by means of an excise tax. Is that your understanding?
Yes. It would be no different than the present tax, but they would just maybe up it by a couple of percentages. Say 31% is the normal tax on non-resident aliens. They could increase it by 5% or something of that nature and call it an excise privilege tax. And we're going to scam an additional 5% of the tax off of the non-resident aliens' earnings.
Well, wait a minute. I may have heard a word you said. I don't know whether I really heard the word. Did you say scam?
Oh, I may have just inadvertently.
Well, it seemed to be appropriate for the discussion. You were talking about a scam.
That's what I'm talking about. But if we just take a step back as citizens and say, okay, here's the tax imposed in Section 1, and then the rate of the taxes and also in Section 1, Section 2, and then the person made liable for the tax would be the withholding agent. So he would have to withhold a tax, and to tell me if I'm following along, Larry, the withholding agent would have to withhold this additional 5% that theoretical that I threw out from the non-resident alien.
Well, are you saying that you would structure this wealth tax like the income tax? Is that what you're talking about? Or are you saying that you would structure the wealth tax to be, tag along with the income tax? Can you explain it a little bit better?
Yeah, it would seem like it would have to fall in line with it in terms of who is going to be subject to the tax. So it would only be natural for the withholding agent to be responsible for collecting that wealth tax from the foreign person, because I see what that's right. Oh, but then they might be in reference to the wealth tax. They might just say, well, the owner of the wealth has the responsibility for filing a return. But the point I just simply wanted to make that if whether a tax is direct or indirect depends upon also who are the people that are involved. And if it's an American citizen here at home, to tax wealth, the only way that could be done would be by a direct property tax. But as to somebody else, like an alien, and you can make it a privilege for him to hold wealth in this country, then you can make it an excise tax. But it wouldn't be applicable to an American citizen. Hey, Gary, I've got 5:14. Do you hear the music coming on? I don't know whether we've got our first break coming up. But hey, folks, we'll have our first break here shortly, and we will be talking about, when we come back, the Constitutional Foundation for Federal Taxes, something that we talked about last week. Remember we were talking about the Pollock case and the Pollock versus Farmers Loan Trust case, that dealt with the constitutionality of the federal income tax?
And then in 1916, the Supreme Court came out with a decision in the Bruce Shaber versus Union Pacific. And welcome back to the second segment of today's show of the Truth Attack Hour. Along with me on this journey is Gary Thomason. A couple of weeks ago, we started on a little project to benefit our listeners. That project was to get into some of the fundamentals related to federal taxation. You know, there's just so many people that don't even know the basics, and we want to teach them the basics. And that's the reason why during the first segment of this afternoon's show, we were talking about Pocahontas' effort, her proposal to bring in a new tax called a wealth tax. And we just briefly described, there's going to be some fundamental problems, some constitutional problems regarding that. Now, that's the reason why knowing something about the basics, the constitutional requirements for taxes is so important. And the way that we have learned, these principles regarding the constitutional principles that relate to federal income taxation is because the Supreme Court has addressed that issue in the past in reference to taxes of a wide variety of matters. There was a tax that the Supreme Court justified as being an excise tax back in the 1790s when it was imposed upon carriages. And over time, there's been a lot of cases. Congress comes along and imposes a new tax. Some of the parties say, we got to challenge the constitutionality of it, and that has happened. Like one of the taxes as a result of the Civil War and Congress coming out and authorizing the issuance of greenbacks. And to get rid of the competition to greenback currency, Congress came along and passed a 10% tax on banknotes, state-issued banknotes. Banknotes issued by the state banks. And that tax drove them out of circulation. Supreme Court in that case held, that's the imposition of an excise tax. Well, in 1894, the income tax was enacted by the Congress of the United States. And I think what we were talking about last week was, some historical background regarding the events of that time. The federal government's revenue was derived primarily from imposed duties and excises, primarily tariffs on goods coming into this country. That was a primary source of revenue for the federal government. And people were concerned. The average American was paying a lot of these excise taxes, but they were looking at the Vanderbilts and, the Rockefellers and the J.P. Morgans. And these were guys that had phenomenal wealth. And so Congress came along and passed an income tax in 1894. And the Supreme Court dealt with the constitutionality of that tax in the Supreme Court case called Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust. And this is something we covered last week. And then after the Supreme Court in that case found, now let's take a look at the subjects of that tax. The subjects of that tax in reference to human beings, there were 4 of them. And the subjects of the 1913 income tax, in reference to human beings, there were also 4. And in both the 1894 and the 1913 Act, the human subjects of the tax, there were taxes on corporations, taxes on trusts, taxes on other entities. I'm talking about just human beings. In 1894 and in 1913, the human beings that were the subject of the income tax were persons residing in the United States, and persons not residing in the United States but engaged in trade or business here. Well, a lot of people want to know, who are these persons? Well, in 1894 and in 1913, you would know who the persons are. You would know that they're aliens because there were 2 other classes of human beings that were the subject of those taxes: citizens at home and citizens abroad. So, in 1894, persons residing in the United States, persons not residing in the United States but engaged in trade and business here, were aliens. And we know that because there were 2 other classes of human beings that were the subject of those taxes, and they were citizens at home and citizens abroad. So the Supreme Court in the Pollock case said, this is the imposition of a direct tax. And that necessitated the 16th Amendment, which was proposed in 1909 and allegedly ratified in 1913. And as a result of the alleged ratification of the 16th Amendment in 1913, remember Philander Knox proclaimed it as being ratified on February 25th, 1913. And in October 1913, Congress comes along with the income tax under the 16th Amendment, or pursuant to the powers of the 16th Amendment. And that tax was also on citizens' homes, citizens abroad, persons residing in the United States, and persons not residing in the United States. And immediately upon that act coming into play, the Union Pacific Railroad says we're going to comply with it, and a guy by the name of Bruce Shaver says, well, I'm going to sue you just like Pollock sued the Farmers Loan and Trust. And that case went also up to the United States Supreme Court kind of quick. The suit was filed in 1914 and is up before the Supreme Court by 1915. And the Supreme Court sits there and deliberates it and comes out with a decision in 1916. And the Bruce Shaver Court, the opinion was written by Chief Justice White.
There's a lot of stuff going on in 1916, wasn't there, Larry?
Yeah. Well, what do you want to have in mind that you want to know for our listeners?
Well, you had the 1913 Tariff Act, income tax, and then that was challenged. And then all of a sudden, they repealed the 1913 Tariff Act, 1913 income tax, in 1916, and then they came out with this thing called a tax on individuals.
Yeah, but isn't that in response to, and this is the point I want to make before we get into that, and this is where you need to come in. I want to talk about what Bruce Shaver did, and I also want to talk about how Bruce Shaver has been completely misconstrued. And then I want to get into what you're talking about. I want you to cover the Civil War taxes, and then we can talk about these acts that came along in 1916. But here's the point I wanted to make. The Bruce Shaver Court came along and says, well, gee, this is something we covered last week, that the income tax doesn't, the 16th Amendment doesn't really amend the Constitution like its predecessor had, Senate Joint Resolution 39, which sought to, expressly amend the taxing provisions of the Constitution. The 16th Amendment just says Congress has the power to lay collect taxable income from whatever source derived without apportionment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration. And those restrictions are the ones that apply to property taxes. So what Chief Justice White says in the Bruce Shaver case is, since the 16th Amendment is not subject to the restraints for direct taxes, it must therefore be an excise tax. And the Bruce Shaver Court said, no new powers of taxation are derived by Congress by means of the 16th Amendment. Now, that's the point I wanted to make. And I think it's real important for our listeners to learn these principles, because when they hear somebody like Pocahontas, who's running for president of the United States, they can put it into context, something about these taxing powers of the federal government, and they would know, well, gee, there's a great probability that what Pocahontas is going to, propose is going to be unconstitutional. Just like the Bruce Shaver court addressed in reference to the 16th Amendment, the Pollock courts addressed in the 1894 Act. Now, having said that, did you have a comment?
Well, Pocahontas, she's an interesting bird. She seems to be real smart on some things, but when it comes to legislation, she doesn't seem to be real sharp, Larry.
Well, she doesn't seem to be real sharp on, her own personal history. She claims to be, have Native American blood, but she takes a blood test and she's only got 1/1000th of Native American heritage. And, she claims that she's getting fired from a job because she's pregnant, but, she admitted previously that is a lie. So how do we, I don't believe anything that comes from Pocahontas' mouth. Do you?
I don't either. Have you seen the picture floating around on the internet?
Now, Jane, you were saying what? Come back on the line and tell us. Pocahontas is Elizabeth Warren. Don't you? I thought everybody in the world knew that Pocahontas is Elizabeth Warren. Is that what you understood, Gary?
Fully.
Okay. So
fact,
when we talk about Pocahontas, we're meaning presidential candidate Elizabeth Warren.
Yes. And there's a picture floating around on the internet of this Cessna, and underneath the wings, it's just full of arrows. And it said this was Elizabeth Warren was visiting the reservations, and there's all these arrows stuck under the bottom of the wings of the airplane. It's just
that's all the Indians shooting at her airplane. Is that it?
Yeah, that's clever. But she's crazy as a loon, but she's extremely smart, but she doesn't have any common sense.
Yeah, that's probably the case, but I think you're giving her a little bit too much credit when you say she's smart. She's just another politician.
That's true.
Well, hey, Gary, let's get back around. We got a few more minutes before we're going to have our next break, leading up to the final segment of this show. Last week we were talking about, the Constitutional Foundation, and all we've done today is rebuttress that. Now, I want to direct our listeners, there's things you need to know about these constitutional requirements for taxation. I address them on my website. Now, to get to my website, I've got two websites. Don't go to Larry Becraft, that website. Go to the Dixieland Law Journal, which is a website I posted on my internet service provider. So the way you'll find the Dixieland Law Journal is to just simply type in Becraft Briefs. This is where I provide legal information on that website, the Dixieland Law Journal, or Dixieland Law Journal. Both search terms will go to this website. Now, when you get to that website, the Dixieland Law Journal, I've got about 8 or 10 other pages linked off the front page. Go down to taxation. There's a page called Taxation that is linked from the front page of the Dixieland Law Journal. Now, when you get over there, click on an uncertainty of the law. There's another file off the taxation page called Uncertainty, and it deals with this proposition. And this is something that people need to know. This page talks about direct taxes and indirect taxes, the excises, duties, and imposts. But it also talks about and shows that even though the Supreme Court in the Bruce-Shaber case came out and declared that the federal income tax is an excise tax, there have been parties in the last 40 and 50 years that have raised the same issue in federal court, and the federal courts have come along and said, hey, some of the federal appellate courts say that, well, the federal income tax pursuant to the 16th Amendment authorizes a direct property tax. And others say, oh, no, it's an excise tax. So what we have here is we have a situation where the federal courts today are in a dispute as to the constitutional nature of the federal income tax, and they're also in a dispute regarding the type of tax that is authorized by means of the 16th Amendment. Now, isn't that something that's important for the people to know, Gary?
I believe it is. And in fact, if I could just throw a curve at that issue, the 16th Amendment gave Congress the power to tax income. Where in the code, I think it's maybe a rhetorical question to a degree, but I think it's also a direct question as to where in the Internal Revenue Code did Congress exercise that power?
Well, explain that a little bit more. I would say when you're taking a look at the Internal Revenue Code, the tax on incomes is going to be found in Subtitle A.
Yes, sir.
Starts at Section 1 and goes up to, above the 1400s, 1532 or something like that. I don't know. It's always changing, the very last section number. Hey, folks, we got a break. We'll be back in a few minutes. And welcome back to the final segment of this afternoon's edition of the Truth Attack Hour. Gary Thomason and I have been talking about, during the first two segments, along with some, going down some rabbit trails. Our whole purpose this afternoon has been to educate our listeners at least about some of the fundamental basics regarding, the constitutional principles that relate to federal taxes. And let me just kind of summarize it again, because I think it's real important. Here we've had Elizabeth Warren, Pocahontas, talking about this new tax that she proposes, the wealth tax. And, there's been a lot of litigation and a lot of decisions from the courts here in America regarding the constitutional classifications of all sorts of taxes. But if you want to describe at the federal level the general rule, you will find the general rule, especially in reference to income taxes, expressed in two cases. The Pollock case in 1894, Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust, which found the income tax to be a direct property tax, the income tax of 1894, and since the court found that to tax income was to exercise the power of direct taxation, and since the 1894 income tax was not apportioned as required by the Constitution for the imposition of direct property taxes, the Supreme Court in the Pollock case found that tax to be unconstitutional. That then necessitated the 16th Amendment. And allegedly, the 16th Amendment was ratified by the states and proclaimed as ratified by Philander Knox on February 25th of 1913. Now, we get, what the 16th Amendment says nothing. Even though it purports to be an amendment to the Constitution, it says nothing about amending anything in the Constitution. And before that, the Senate Joint Resolution 39 had expressly stated, we're going to amend the provisions of the United States Constitution. But Congress said, nope, we're not going to propose that to the states for ratification. So Senate Joint Resolution 39 went down in flames, and so Congress comes up with Senate Joint Resolution 40, which is the 16th Amendment. Congress will have the power to lay exact taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states, and without regard to any census or enumeration, which says nothing about amending any provision in the United States Constitution. But based upon the 16th Amendment, in October of 1913, Congress comes along with the first income tax pursuant to the 16th Amendment, and a lawsuit was filed. Bruce Shaver sued the Union Pacific Railroad. That case went to the United States Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court, now that you know this history, that there was a first effort to amend the Constitution to provide for an income tax, and that was by means of Senate Joint Resolution 39, which exactly said something about amending the taxing provisions of the United States Constitution, but that effort failed. And, this is kind of the background for the decision in the Bruce Shaver case. In the Supreme Court, pursuant to the Bruce Shaver decision, written by Justice White, he says, well, look, this is in essence what the Bruce Shaver case says. The 16th Amendment says income taxes shall not be subject to apportionment. Well, direct taxes are subject to apportionment. But since the 16th Amendment says income taxes shall not be subject to apportionment, in essence what the decision in the Bruce Shaver case says is that, then all federal income taxes must fall within the constitutional classification of being an excise tax. So that is the fundamental background that is important when you take into consideration, when you're trying to learn how the federal income tax operates. Now, Gary, have we got any further observations we need to make about this constitutional foundation for the federal income tax before we get into, specifics about, the various tax acts?
Yeah, I guess you could just look at it from the perspective of you have these tax acts that, like the Pollock decision, 1894, 1895, where, Congress had, set forth these specifics, and they rolled in that citizens, whether at home or abroad, they threw those in there, and that became, in my view, the strike point where the Supreme Court had to pick that case up and clarify how citizens could be taxed at home. Is that a fair way of looking at it?
Yeah. And so what you're saying is that, since the subjects of the 1894 income tax include as citizens at home, and, citizens have a right to earn income, so you really couldn't justify it as being an excise tax in reference to citizens at home. So, is what you're saying is that it's almost kind of a foregone conclusion that the Pollock court, they wanted to deal with this income tax question, and, it just seems like a matter of course that they declared it to be a direct tax. And since the tax wasn't direct, it hadn't been imposed as direct tax, it was unconstitutional. Is that your point?
Right. That's the way I see it. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's real important to know who were the four human beings that were the subject of the 1894 Act. Knowing that, it was citizens at home, citizens abroad, and also persons residing in the United States and persons not residing in the United States. That has a direct bearing upon understanding what the Supreme Court said in the Pollock case. I mean, is that your point?
Exactly. When we look at it from that perspective, they had citizens at home, which would be citizens domiciled in one of the 50 several states. Of course, back then, Alaska and Hawaii wasn't quite states yet, but the tax was imposed on citizens outside the United States up until 1894.
Well, now you're getting into, and that's something we needed to talk about, but it relates to what was done in the Civil War.
Right.
And so you're saying that, what you want to talk about is, and that's probably going to have to spill over into next week, but I think now, in the 6 or 7 minutes we got left in this program, I think you probably need to get back into the Civil War. What you're saying is that to really understand the 1894 Act, you have to understand something about what was being developed by means of the Civil War income tax acts. Right?
I think that's exactly the point, yeah.
Okay. Well, take off. Lay a foundation so that we can get into this matter next week.
Okay, well, yeah, just everybody should just scribble down on a piece of paper that in 1861, 1862, 1864, and 1866 in particular, those were what Larry characterized as the Civil War taxes. The 1861 Act actually didn't go into effect, but the 1862 Act did, and the 1862 Act was really the first income tax, if I recall correctly.
That's correct.
And so when we look at the way that the Supreme Court laid it out in a case called Railroad Company versus Jackson, the Supreme Court is saying the first tax of this kind was imposed by the Act of Congress passed August 5th, 1861. And then that didn't actually kick in until 1862, but by then, in 1862, the 90th section of that 1862 Act directed that there should be levied and collected a tax of 3% on the annual income of every person residing in the United States over $600 and under $10,000, and when exceeding $10,000, a tax of 5%. So the rate of the tax went from 3 to 5% based upon how much the person residing in the United States made, and I don't think it's a stretch based on what we've been talking about. That person is a foreigner. residing in the United States.
As
is that fair to say?
Expressed in the Civil War income tax. You're saying that during the Civil War, there was an income tax imposed upon persons residing in the United States, and all of them. And in fact, the Civil War income tax remained in effect until the early 1870s. But during that period of time, from 1862 until it was repealed in the early 1870s, there was a tax imposed upon the income of persons residing in the United States, all during that period, right?
Correct. And to add more color to the picture, and a tax of 5% on citizens residing abroad. So you had 5% tax on citizens residing abroad, and then you had an income tax imposed on every person residing in the United States over $600, under $10,000, and when exceeding $10,000, a tax of 5%. So,
are you going to tell us who this person is? Is that it?
It seems to me that person would be a foreigner, a non-resident alien, but it's an alien residing in the United States.
Okay.
And you have citizens residing abroad, foreigners residing within the United States.
So the language, persons residing in the United States, citizens residing abroad, those are the terms that were used during the Civil War income tax acts, right?
Right, correct.
And you're placing some significance on the meaning of the word person residing in the United States.
Well, the person can't be a citizen because it's just saying citizens residing abroad, and you have a person, every person residing in the United States had to be a foreigner. It just through deduction.
All right. That's a very interesting observation, Mr. Thomason.
Well, and what kind of gives some credence to it is there was a character named Mr. Jackson. Mr. Jackson had some railroad bonds, and he was a citizen of Ireland, but he wasn't living in the United States. He was in Ireland, but he had these railroad bonds, and this is what this case was about. And so through the body of this case, it kind of explains how this Tax Act was constructed. The Supreme Court starts off.
Tell us the name of the case and the year that it was published.
I'm sorry, Larry. I thought I already did that. I must be sleeping. No. But it's called Railroad Company versus Jackson. And it's 74 U.S. 262.
And the year would be?
1868.
Wow. So you're telling us about, and hey, look, Gary, it's 5:54, right? Hey, Gary, we're gonna have to get into this next week, okay?
Let's do it.
All right. But in the interim, how can people get in touch with you?
Oh, they could just email me at Gary, Gary, at ntn.net. Just scribble it down on a piece of paper, and you get a chance to send me an email. Just send it to Gary at ntn.net. That would be Nancy, Paul, Nancy, for people that don't understand South Louisiana.
Well, hey, Gary, the music's on in the background letting us know the end of the program's arrived. Thanks for being my co-host today.
As always.
And folks, be sure to listen to the other great programs here on this network and come back next week for the conclusion of this exciting series. See you then.